Hi, everyone. I'm so excited about this next hour of my life and our lives because I'm here with two of my dear friends, Michael and Patti from Genova, who have actually at this point been friends, I would say, for years, which is
Yeah,
really
sure.
exciting.
Yeah.
And Genova is a lab company that I've been such an admirer of and fan of and user of, customer of, practitioner with for actually about 6 years when I left my surgical residency and started down the beautiful path of functional medicine and opened my own private practice. Genova was the first lab that I had a contract with and was really in love with specifically their nutritional testing, which is called NutriVal, which is urine and blood and tells you so much about your micronutrient status and is so actionable for patients that I was seeing. And now through Genova Connect, which is a direct consumer arm of the brand. So you don't need to have your functional medicine doctor order this for you. You can actually order it online. There's an incredible test that is very similar to the full NutriVal. And that is what I had done recently. And we are going to go through my results over the next hour with two of the literal experts at the company. So this is a huge honor for me. And I'm hoping what this can do is help people understand a lot more about oxidative stress, mitochondrial dysfunction, toxins, this idea of functional lab testing, and what you might be able to learn from this test, especially if you're someone who is trying to figure out where to shape your diet and your supplement routine and actually have data behind the why of what you're doing. So first, I just want to turn it over to you, Patti and Michael, to just briefly introduce yourselves and your role at Genova. And then we're going to just jump in, and I am going to be a student here. And I'm so excited to learn from you both. Thank you so much for doing this.
We are blessed and honored to call you a friend,
Yeah,
Casey. Just so you know, we're huge fans of you and your biggest cheerleaders, and you know that. I'm Dr. Patti Devers. I'm a conventionally trained internal medicine doctor who worked in the hospital for about 20 years before joining here at Genova and rediscovering my passion and love for medicine. We are very passionate about what we do here. I serve as the chief clinical officer on the leadership team here, and Michael and I run a team of doctors in the medical affairs department. And our job is to teach other clinicians the genius of what these tests can do and how they can actually help patients get to the root cause of what conditions or complaints they might be having. I do a lot of the content writing. Michael is more on the product side. You want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Michael Chapman here. I'm a naturopathic physician by training, and at Genova Diagnostics, a lot of what I do is around product innovation. So I spend a lot of time digging into the literature and PubMed, looking for new biomarkers and understanding what these things might be telling us, and then putting it all together in one place so we have a thorough kind of comprehensive evaluation, whether that's for nutrition, whether that's for gastrointestinal health, and hopefully make the reports look pretty at the end of the day too. So
I'm going to brag on Michael. I think he's understanding it. He's responsible for the beautiful report we're about to go through and putting it together and synthesizing this information. So well done, sir.
Well, and I would say any day that we get to spend a little time with Casey Means, our good friend, is one of my favorite days in the month. So yeah, I appreciate being here.
I love you guys. Thank you so much. So let's just get started. What's the best way to dive into this incredible report?
Let me start by saying, if you're a patient out there, a consumer, and you're used to getting labs done at LabCorp through your doctor, especially nutritionally, they're going to send you for basic blood work. They may or may not send you for direct measurements of various nutrients, like what's my vitamin B12 level, which is a very general, well-known, everyone has had labs like this done. What Genova does, we take this a step further. We want to know what's your biochemical blueprint. You specifically, Casey, means not compared to everyone else. You specifically, we want to know what your biochemistry is telling us and how we can support you in a very personalized way. So what the Metabolomix is a mixture of many different types of biomarkers. And don't get bogged down into all of these words. I'm just letting you know that the base of the Metabolomix is a urinary evaluation, first morning void urine, which looks at something called organic acids, which Michael will get into in a little bit. Also amino acids. These are the building blocks of protein. There's also the option to add on a blood spot, a finger prick of looking at fatty acids, which are very, very important. And again, we're going to get into this. There's also an add-on to look at toxins in the urine, as well as genetic information by swabbing your cheek. So what we do We take all of those biomarkers. It's a lot. It sounds like a lot. But what we do is we put it all together algorithmically to give you the specific results you need. And it's a combination of two different types of measurement. And I just want to put this out there because it's different than what you'll get at LabCorp or Quest. We are looking directly at some of these nutrients, a direct measurement, but we're also leaning on something that we call a functional assessment. And what we're doing in all of these biomarkers is measuring steps in biochemical pathways that we know require specific vitamins and minerals to make the enzymes go through the pathway. So if there's a backup, that's a key that on a very cellular biochemical level, you might need a nutrient, even if your vitamin B12 level is fine. On a cellular level, you may not be using it properly. So that's kind of what this report does. And like I said, Michael's designed this report. And if you want to scroll down a little bit, Michael, on this report, you'll see that we put this all together right on the front page. We synthesize it into what we're calling here these functional imbalance scores, or these functional pillars, because we want to drive home the point that nutrition underpins so many different functions in your body. So we take all the information to show you that your nutrition or deficiencies or insufficiencies in your nutritional biomarkers can show a need for antioxidant support, a need for mitochondrial support, the powerhouse of your cells, a need for modulating inflammation in your body. We can tell whether you have an exposure to some types of environmental toxins. We're also looking at methylation support, which helps to turn genes on and off throughout your body. So right here on the front page, we have these pillars and show you which biomarkers go into each of these pillars, but we're also giving you guidelines and scores based on whether or not you need a little love in that area. Is there a minimal need for support? Then that's in green. And looking at your report case, pretty good with exposures and pretty darn good for methylation support, which is awesome. We're also showing you in yellow if you have a moderate need for support, which we have a couple pillars here, which we'll dive into, a little bit of work to be done. But thankfully, there's nothing here in red that's overwhelmingly alarming. I mean, your case means this looks great. We're going to get into the specifics. And if you go to the next page, like I said, through that algorithm and through all of these biomarkers, right here on page 2, we're actually telling you what your needs are for each of these nutrients and giving some suggested recommendations, like in this case, 5,000 units of vitamin A might be helpful to help your biochemistry, you specifically, Casey means, to optimize your health and cellular wellness. And so you'll see we go through all of these specific nutrients, and we're going to tell you based on your findings, what your biochemical blueprint is telling us that might help you to have optimal cells and health and energy. And we'll even give you a recommendation here whether or not GI might be an issue by looking at some of these indirect biomarkers and looking at fatty acids, and even scrolling down a little bit, Michael, specific amino acids that might help. However, that's those 2 pages right there is all you really need to act on the results of this test. Don't be overwhelmed. It's a lot and it looks really scary, but we've put it all together so you know exactly what to do and how to act on that. Now, the other piece of this is our goal is not for you to throw a bunch of supplements down your throat every single day for the rest of your life. In fact, part of the beauty of this report are the next few pages where we say, okay, each nutrient, we want to give some education to you as a patient or a consumer. What is vitamin A? Why should I care? What are some of the symptoms I might be looking for to see if I have an insufficiency? But the most important piece within these teaching pages is under each of these specific nutrients is that little red circle that gives you food sources. Our goal is to outline where you can get some of these sources in food, right? And take better control of your diet. And so the first several pages of this report are really all you need to act on and all you need to optimize your cellular health and wellness. And as we go through the rest of this report, we're going to say a lot of big words. Don't be scared, because really everything is synthesized in the first couple pages here, but it's really interesting. It's really interesting biochemistry, and it kind of speaks to how we come about finding your specific insufficiencies of nutrients and making these recommendations. And, you know, I'm going to kick this next part to Michael because it's going to get a little bit heavy and he's really good.
That was such an helpful overview, Patti. I think that I want to make sure to like double click into and just like reemphasize one of the most, I think, such interesting things you said about this idea that, and correct me if I'm wrong. So the testing with the urine and the blood, it's not actually testing, for instance, magnesium levels or taurine levels. This is a functional test, meaning it's looking at different biomarkers in the blood that are essentially byproducts of different chemical reactions in the body. And based on the levels of those, we can understand whether that particular part of the biochemical pathway needs more support with these nutrient like cofactors. So if like A turns to B in the body, and that's like a chemical reaction that happens, and the protein that makes that conversion requires magnesium and zinc, and we see a big buildup of A, that means like it's not converting to B properly. That means we probably need a lot more of the micronutrients for that like protein. So it's inferring what we need functionally based on these different things that are being measured. Is that accurate? Is that
Yeah.
It's a good representation, but there are also some direct measurements. Like we are looking at amino acids. We are directly looking at your fatty acid levels. We're directly looking at the toxins, but all those little biochemistry pieces, Casey, that you just outlined, that's exactly what we're doing there. And Michael's going to show you in real time what.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think a way that I try to envision it a little bit is kind of like a traffic jam, right? I think of these biochemical pathways as like there's all this traffic within the cell. Things are going over here and going over there. And I've got pulled up just kind of one example here with the fatty acids, just to kind of demonstrate how the logic of this works. Where in our body, we use fats that we eat from our diet, and we use those ultimately to make energy, but it takes a lot of steps along the way. And one of the first steps is that hopefully it'll come down into this process called beta oxidation. But to do so, it actually requires nutrients in the form of particularly vitamin B2 and magnesium. That is what helps that process. But if the body doesn't have enough of those two things on hand, then what you see is this gets blocked like a traffic jam. And then there's this offshoot to where these things will then turn into other things that we're then measuring, like adipic acid, and in your case, subearic acid. So seeing that subearic acid elevate gives us an indication of perhaps a little bit of a traffic jam owing to maybe a need for magnesium or vitamin B2. And it's kind of like that on steroids. We are doing that kind of throughout the entire biochemical processes. We're looking for every traffic highway that requires magnesium or B6 or B12 or any of these, and we're adding it all together and saying, wow, okay, these highways are backed up. This is probably telling me that there might be more need for more support in those nutrients.
And it's also possible to have these needs with a normal lab core blood draw that you've gotten, because we're looking at the biochemistry in your cells.
Yeah, so to kind of place it along the spectrum, Casey, I know, we talk a lot about how a lot of what you're going to get from your annual physical and a lot of these measurements are really looking for signs of disease or overt problems, right? We're not looking for traffic jams, we're looking for accidents. And so even if you get like a vitamin D or a B12 or a folate from your labs, from your annual physical, they're looking for deficiency. But we know that deficiency isn't what we're shooting for. The lack of deficiency that's not the same as optimization, right? We want to optimize the system, and we want to look for any of those early indicators of need for support.
That was great. Accidents in the traffic jam. Loving that.
That's such a great analogy. Yeah, we don't want to wait till the traffic jam. We want to see when there's backups happening and be able to intervene earlier. And also, I feel like it's so interesting because what those once a year lab tests don't take into account is that our body has a dynamic need for different nutrients based on different conditions. I think about, in very high stress periods of life, you might be burning through a lot more micronutrients to make particular hormones and may need to support the body more. Or there's probably a million examples like that. Or maybe you need more amino acids because of whatever, workout regimen you're doing. And so just looking at a single raw number of like a level of a B vitamin or something in the blood, like it may not actually be meeting your particular need. And that's what this test can kind of show you more detail on.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. And so that's kind of the general gist of not only the approach to the evaluation, but then also this page too. This page is definitely a little overwhelming, especially if you're not like a Michael Chapman in the world who loves staring at biochemical pathways.
She means she geeks out with us. We all geek out.
Yeah. We're in a safe space. But what we know is that this is kind of the model, so people do understand why we're looking at these markers that have weird, strange names and what they mean to the overall test. And so it's kind of a general general schematic depiction, because really at the end of the day, Casey, you talk a lot about energy in your book, Good Energy. And so this is the energy production system, right? This is from top to bottom how we turn food into, down here in this electron transport chain, energy, right? And so we're first starting with this big idea of like, is there anything that we're seeing backed up in here that we need to kind of alleviate to let the body make energy? And that's kind of the general purpose of this page. I will say, as we start to kind of pivot and dig into your results, one of the first things that kind of stood out to me was, if you see here, kind of the way that this generally works. I'm gonna get my little pointer out just because it makes me feel like
pointer.
I do. It makes me feel like a
So helpful. This feels like the best high school, like college biology class I've ever taken. I was actually just thinking, how cool would it be if every college biology or AP biology student got this test and could actually understand the Krebs cycle and the citric acid through the lens of their own biology? We need to make that that would be so, just to make it relevant to oneself.
Yes.
You know, and also it so clearly would entrench the idea that food and nutrients are critical for this process working, because you actually, so anyways, that came to mind, how cool that would be.
When I first started here, I was petrified of this test. I saw the citric acid cycle. It strikes fear in the hearts of man. And then I realized, I had the aha moment you just described. No, this is the key. This is how our food becomes energy. And it's so cool. And so, like, looking at this, Michael's about to go through some of the rest of your results, and you just go, wow.
Yeah,
cool.
I mean, we all sat there. We had to learn these dumb words and this Krebs cycle, but we didn't realize it had meaning.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
To apply meaning to it was, and so like it basically, you have fats, you have carbohydrates, and you have protein. These are kind of our main macronutrients, but ultimately they all shuttle down and turn into this thing called acetyl CoA. They're all trying to get there because this is really what does the magic for energy production. Now from there, we can go into this circular citric acid cycle, and that is what spits off all these components that are used for energy production. But another thing that we can do is actually use acetyl-CoA for ketogenesis. And if you've heard about the ketogenic diet or people doing ketosis, things like that, a lot of times you'll hear about them measuring this molecule called beta-hydroxybutyric acid, which is actually a ketone body. And so the first thing that popped out when I looked at this test, I was like, oh, I wonder if Casey was in some degree of ketosis. I wonder if, like, you know, she was low carbohydrate or something at the time. What might have been explaining some of that ketone level? And Casey, I know we just talked about that, but if you don't mind just commenting a little bit on why that might have shown up for you.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I'll have to go back and look at the exact date, because sometimes we'll do a 24-hour fast on Mondays. And so then I'm always have higher ketone levels the day after. And I do check my ketones with a Keto Mojo strip. And because of the diet, which I eat, which is fairly low carb and no refined processed grains or sugars, I tend to have like a baseline ketone level of like 0.6, 0.7, just with my normal diet. And then if I'm fasting, it will often go up to like 1.1, 1.2. So that is congruent with, I think, the diet that I'm eating and the way I fast and whatnot. I have actually moved away from that fasting regimen because I do think it's having an impact on hormones more broadly. But at this time that I took the test back in April, I was still doing that. So that would make sense from that standpoint.
Yeah, and that does make sense too, because here when we measured them, and this was from the urine, it was at a 3.8, so it was outside reference range, meaning that it was a little bit higher than a sort of average healthy cohort individuals who aren't doing any sort of carbohydrate restriction or monitoring, but it's not so high that it was outside our upper limits of detection, like when we went through this with Dr. Dom D'Agostino, and it was like sky high through the roof, you know, and it's like couldn't even see how many there were because there was too many of them. And so that's consistent with kind of what you're explaining about how your diet was during this time.
So if you were on a full ketogenic diet, would that number be off the charts typically, like far?
Yeah.
Okay.
And when I've had this on myself when I was in ketosis, it was greater than our upper limits of detection. So yeah, they're way up there.
And then there can also be pathologic states where you are making ketones as well, which is what you're kind of looking out for with this. And so if you're not in a ketogenic diet and your ketones are a little bit high, what would that be telling you?
So if you're not on a ketogenic diet, what that tends to be is actually a problem with metabolic health.
Yeah.
Because as the system becomes more and more resistant or less able to use glucose for energy, it has to divert towards ketone production. So as people actually become more and more metabolically dysfunction, they ironically will start naturally making more ketones as well, which is actually on the flip side, it can be used as a marker for metabolic health in someone on a ketogenic diet, but it can also be a marker for worsening glycemic control on somebody who's not on a ketogenic diet or maybe has, concerns with prediabetes, things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And so it's a fascinating marker in that respect because it kind of goes both directions. And actually, the one, since we're talking about it, the one right above it is also kind of a sister cousin to that ketone as well, this alpha hydroxybutyrate. So you have beta and alpha. They tend to reflect similar things on these tests. But I'll take a step back too and just mention, so this whole page is called the organic acids. And
What's an organic acid, Michael? Maybe we should define that.
you should have prepped me for that question, Patty.
No, because it's like these are words that people don't understand. So let's just say, what is an organic acid?
I mean, at their basic level, they're chemicals that are organic in nature, meaning they have carbon. The way that we use them is they're kind of like intermediates of these different cellular processes. And most of the historical way in which they were used was actually to diagnose genetic diseases, what's called inborn errors of metabolism, which were very, very severe, usually diagnosed early in life in children who might have developmental disabilities or things of that nature. Kind of genetic mutations will show problems with these organic acids. It wasn't until much later that we realized, hey, these are all kind of the cars on the road. These are all the ones that if we're trying to understand biochemistry and we know what these cofactors are, like vitamins and minerals, then we can put these things together to say, wow, now we can start to use not just for diagnosis of inborn error of metabolism and mutations and things like that, but we can use them functionally. And so that's kind of how it's not as much about knowing that they're organic acids or what the name is, but like how we're using them, I think is really the important part.
And how do you recommend someone I mean, because these pages are the ones that I feel like would throw people for a total loop. Like, what do you do with this? Is benzoic acid being red a problem? Like, how do you recommend people approach these pages, if at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first thing I always say is like, everything from page 8 onward is your data, right? That's your data set. And that's all the data that we use to roll up to give you these evaluations on page 1 for major highlights and key things that might be going on that you should look into. And then also it's the data that we use to generate the nutrient need recommendations or the overview. So I would say if it's freaking you out, if it's like way intimidating and you're not interested in it, then understanding that it's the data that generates the recommendations and the evaluations, you could probably just stop there. But there are, if you want to dig in a little bit deeper, some things that'll help you understand it. And so first is look at the headers. This first one is called malabsorption and dysbiosis markers. So right out of the gate, you can say this entire section here is basically looking for an indication of dysbiosis. And the more things you find elevated, the more suspicious I would be about, A, what's your GI like? Do you have symptoms? Are you having GI problems? Well, you've got some indications that you actually might have some dysbiosis going on in your gut. And so that might warrant further evaluation with maybe like a GI test.
And I would say don't freak out over any one biomarker. Like, for example, in this section, you're looking for the preponderance of evidence. Like, oh, I need more love in my GI tract. I need to figure out what's going on there. So try not to freak out over any one biomarker because we've done all the work for you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say with your test here, Casey, we're seeing a few things pop off in the yellow area and a couple things showing up in the red. Now, I also know that traditionally, I think you've had a pretty good consumption of phenol-rich foods, berries, cherries, plant-based antioxidants. And so sometimes we can see a lot of these markers show up in somebody who's maybe doing a smoothie every morning or things of that nature, because as you have more of those things in your diet, they'll turn into these products. So there's a little bit of an additional thing to know about, hey, maybe somebody's asymptomatic, but these are showing up. I'm always like, do you have a morning smoothie? Because if you eat a lot of berries, cherries, that could be another reason why these might be high as well.
Mm-hmm.
And in
So
that,
interesting.
yeah, that wouldn't be a problem, right? That's not an
Right.
Yeah.
indication of something, hey, you need to stop your smoothie. It's just that traditionally most people, especially who, take this test are not doing a lot of those things. And
Mm.
so if these are showing up elevated aside from a high, fruit consumption, then that's probably a good indication of a dysbiosis.
And do you have any sense from your data set of like, do you see people after doing this test and then doing an intervention based on what's in the recommendations that they see pretty decent movement of these towards the green with like if someone were to say, okay, I got this test, I'm going to add in all the things that it says on page 2, what kind of improvements do you see in people? Like, and can people, would you recommend this be a test that someone do and then make an intervention and then redo to see how things are going?
Yeah. We see it all the time. We see results greatly improve just by using some of the interventions from page 2. And then sometimes we get clinicians call us up and they say, all right, we did the test, we did the intervention. It's really not moving the needle. How come? And then we start diving into, well, could there be a problem with malabsorption, maldigestion? You can give them all the food and supplements you want, but if it's really not pushing the needle, what's going on in the gut? The other thing to consider is that if you have strenuous exercise or a really toxic load that could be interfering with some of the nutrients as well, that can also play a fact, because day to day, some of these things change. You said it earlier, right? Like they made this intervention, but then they also started this big exercise program. And that's a whole different ballgame than when they did the first test.
Mhm.
So there are some reasons why it wouldn't move the needle, but we often see it nearly normalized based on that.
Yeah, it's not uncommon to see it almost like peeling back the layers of an onion, where we kind of have this initial intervention and we see some things get better, but then sometimes we might actually see things shift where like, okay, now we need to focus on this other thing.
Yeah.
And so we do typically recommend, people will have some sort of follow-up and some that can be 3 months, 6 months, or like at a yearly physical, depending on whatever frequency that works for people. But yeah, we tend to see some improvements and then maybe new areas of focus. And then sometimes just because we're all unique and we have our own unique genetics, there's probably some things that like we might just need ongoing support all the time because like
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
doesn't want to move.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So interesting.
Yeah. And so getting to some of these other organic acids you mentioned, like where to start, again, I go back to the headers and this cellular energy mitochondrial marker section. I'm not going to get into much of that because we talked a little bit about it on the previous page. That's all these biomarkers listed out. And again, they're telling us how well are you producing energy? How well is that mitochondria working? And what nutrients might help support that a little bit better? As an example, we pointed out this one earlier, the subearic acid. But you mentioned actually that you take a fair amount of magnesium. There's a couple other places on this test, I'll kind of point out a general theme, where did see some pretty strong indications for vitamin B2. And I'll point out a couple other ones. So in the sense that, man, it sounds like you're getting a lot of magnesium in your diet. That makes me lean a little bit more towards vitamin B2. I was even looking at this and thinking I hadn't prepped you for this, but I was like, I wonder if Casey gets headaches because sometimes I see like vitamin B2 and needs for vitamin B2 show up with
Interesting. No headaches. I mean, this is the funny thing of it's like I just sent my metabolic biomarkers to my whole newsletter list, and they're all in the optimal range. And then also I have no symptoms. Like I have no gut symptoms. I have no physical symptoms. I feel great all the time, basically. And so it's interesting because I think that's actually part of it's like even though I do feel good, like it looks like here there are gut things that I could potentially optimize for long-term overall health, which I think is actually a really important point. Like you might not have gut symptoms, and yet I seem to be B2 low, and I have, I've got these markers off. So I don't know. I want to be fully aware of what might be going on under the hood, and so that I can prevent long-term issues. And I think that's why this is so valuable to me. And yeah, just knowing that is really important.
No, it was really great what you said as far as, if we could all feel amazing every single day like Casey means, that's one thing. But also the fact that you're aware and you're doing the things to also optimize. You know, we always talk about like the way you are today is the way you're going to feel in 10 years, right? Like what you do today in your lifestyle is going
Yeah,
to be where you are at in 10 years. And so, you know, just kind of having that forethought of, you know, what are there just minor tweaks? Because at the end of the day, Casey, this test looks really good. You know,
Mhm.
this is about picking out what are just some of the key things here and there that we might want to adjust, tweak, and that sort of thing.
Totally.
Yeah. This next section here too, again, we don't be overwhelmed or intimidated by the words. What's really important is that these are kind of specific indicators for certain nutrients, B1, B2, and B3 in particular. These four actually are kind of interesting because they come from our skeletal muscle tissue for the most part. They come from the breakdown of branched chain amino acids.
Hmm.
And so it goes back a little bit to what I was talking about with respect to that sort of, are you ketotic? Are you low carbohydrate? And this is telling me like maybe to a little bit more of a degree, you're breaking down some of your muscle to use for energy and also to create ketones. So that might be something to look at too. And at the end of the day, all of that does require vitamins B1, B2, B3, which I don't think you were taking necessarily at the time. And
Mm-mm.
so, you know, that might help support that system go a little bit better. But this last one here, I'm circling glutaric acid, is another specific B2 marker. And that one, I actually don't see elevated as commonly, to be honest, as a lot of these alpha keto ones above it. So again, another little kind of notch in that like suspicion list of, what are some of the things, what are the highlights? And I think B2 is showing up as like, that would be something I'd bring on board.
So these could be representative of muscle breaking down.
Hmm.
Is okay? Now, at this moment in life, when I did this test, it was like peak book tour. I literally did not lift a weight for like 3 months, which I'm not proud of, but can becoming deconditioned from a weightlifting perspective lead to that because you're basically not keeping up your muscle protein synthesis as much? Or is it, yeah, like that was sort of the context. I was walking a lot, and doing a lot of hiking, but really not lifting weights. So I don't know if that, and I do feel like I got less strong during the period, but does that feel relevant to this, or is that a different thing that's happening? Is
I
this
think
more
it's
like,
probably two things. I think it's
yeah,
one, that cortisol is catabolic,
yes. And
right?
my stress was high.
Yeah.
Right. And so you probably had a higher circulating cortisol, which was just naturally breaking down some of the muscular tissue. And I'm not talking about you're fully catabolic, but this is like your
Subtle.
body's needing energy and you're not using glucose as much as maybe compared to a lot of people. We're already producing a little bit of ketones. So you're probably tapping into your muscle stores just a little bit. That
Yeah.
combined with the cortisol from the stress, that's probably what we're seeing. And so if there is additional needs for B vitamins, then that would also support that process as well to maximize what your body is doing to make energy.
So interesting. Very
Yeah.
cool. So if people are putting on muscle actively and are nutritionally supported in that, would you tend to see these maybe be in the better range? Like, because it's not breaking down?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
And interestingly, people who are actively putting on muscle, sometimes we will actually see moderate to lower levels of circulating amino acids because the body's storing them, right? They're using
Yes.
them in the muscle, they're not circulating them in the blood. And so that's not uncommon too. So that's something to keep in mind, especially for our athletes.
Cool.
Yeah. Underneath that, we have these methylation markers. That's very specific markers, very sensitive for folate and vitamin B2 needs. Those look good here. Biotin markers showing up, giving maybe a little bit of an indication. And again, don't have to memorize these. This is all just data. And so if you go back up, I can imagine
Hmm.
your recommendation for biotin here, we're seeing a little bit on the high normal side. And then you see B2, like we've been talking about, triggering at the highest, right? So this is just showing you how the test works.
Yes. Yes. Cool.
Um, a couple other things that I was going to point out. And so one of them is, so these catecholamine markers, catecholamine is a fancy word basically for like adrenaline and noradrenaline. And so we might see these levels higher in somebody who is perhaps about to like be on
Little
tour for a
stress.
New York Times bestseller. And so that makes a lot of sense there. And another one underneath that, this serotonin marker is actually it's a turnover product from serotonin, but not necessarily the serotonin in your brain, right? We kind of think about serotonin and how it helps with mood, but we forget that almost 95% of our body's serotonin is made in the gut. And so that's another thing that I would be thinking of. You're turning over a lot of serotonin in the GI tract, and that actually, well, the reason why it does that is it stimulates motility. Like it's one of the main things in your gut that stimulates motility. So it's not uncommon for when we see this marker high, and I don't know if this is the case for you, Casey, but oftentimes we see that correlate with people who have kind of issues around motility, particularly like loose stool. So
Interesting. You
yeah.
know, I'll have to go back and look at my NutriVal from a few years ago and see about this, but I dealt with very bad IBS about 10 years ago for 2 years, and that's symptomatically that's totally gone. But I wonder, I mean, I don't know if there's ever like lingering stuff that can happen. I don't have any GI symptoms now, just like normal, regular stools, not to TMI too much, but like, solid, whatever, just like very pretty typical, I would say. So but I have had a history of like definitely irritable bowel syndrome in the past. So I don't know what to make of that for my current, is there, do you ever see this high in the absence of symptoms and it's telling you something about, other factors in the lifestyle that could be contributing, or diet?
Yeah, well, I would say, my hypothesis without knowing 100% is maybe that you just have a natural predisposition to make more serotonin in your gut. But what you're doing with your diet, as far as your fiber intake and everything else, is that you have regulated it to the extent that you're not having symptoms, right? And so I tend to find that people who have IBS that kind of goes in this direction, if they don't have adequate fiber intake, then they will have symptoms. But fiber does wonders in the sense of actually modulating motility.
So interesting. Okay.
And then the last little section, I'll just point out another one that I find kind of interesting. The rest of these on the bottom they're also interesting, but you look pretty good on them. This pyroglutamic acid is a precursor to our body's main antioxidant called glutathione. Glutathione is what's responsible for basically taking care of most of the free radicals that our body produces naturally. We think about free radicals as, we're jogging behind a bus and we're getting exhaust and all these free radicals and this stuff that we get from the outside. But our body makes its own free radicals just by making energy. Like that's a dirty process, even within our cells. And so this glutathione is really what helps to clean all of that up. And so right here, this pyroglutamic acid being a precursor, it's up a little bit, which is making me wonder, because we didn't measure glutathione. We do on the NutriVal, but not on this test. It makes me wonder, are you upregulating your body's kind of need for more antioxidant? Is there something that's driving, a little bit more cleanup? Or do we need to support that production of glutathione with some nutrients, and particularly magnesium and are huge ones around that.
And cysteine, glutamic acid, and glycine, which are the amino acids that are needed to make glutathione. And I also say it's not just toxic exposures. Exercise can cause oxidative stress.
Yeah.
Just children growing, that's oxidative stress. That's part of what keeps your body going, right? To your point, when we saw the citric acid cycle at the bottom, that electron transport chain, there's a lot of oxidative stress there. To Michael's point, it's a messy process. And so the body, the good news, is well equipped to take care of most oxidative stress. And sometimes under higher amounts of oxidative stress, it needs some help. Things like glutathione, things like those nutrients we just talked about. And pyroglutamic acid is just a little clue that tells us there might be a little upregulation there. And that's what we're seeing there.
Yeah.
Interesting. So if you're having more need to make glutathione, it's not going to deplete the pyroglutamic acid. It's going to upregulate the amount of pyroglutamic acid. It's like, it'll push your body to make more.
Yes.
Because I can imagine people thinking, I feel like that would deplete the precursor, but it actually upregulates the amount of the precursor you have.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So generally, in response to oxidative stress, like our bodies are incredible. They're so wise. They're like, all right, like pump up all the gas on everything that will make antioxidants, right? It responds based on need. And flip side is kind of similar too. We think of if we measure somebody's glutathione, which we can, and it's low, oftentimes people are like, oh my gosh, like I don't have any glutathione, and I've been doing IV glutathione every day for 12 years or something like that. And so what we'll sometimes say is like, the body actually generates glutathione based on need. And if you don't have a lot of signs of damage, which we don't see on some tests, that could be an indication of your body's just like, hey, we're good. Like we don't need a lot right now. And that's another thing. Just demonstrates how amazing, but also kind of complicated, to be honest, the system is.
Yeah.
Getting more and more.
Amazing.
Yeah, how it works.
Oh, I'm really interested in this lipid peroxides. Oh my gosh. But also all the other ones too. But that is, I can't wait to talk about that.
So were we. When we opened up this test, we all went, Michael and I are like, what's up with the lipid peroxides? We got to talk to Casey. But as you describe what you were going through at the time of this test being done, I think that speaks to. So lipid peroxides are just signs of oxidative damage to lipids and fats. And it happens under times of oxidative stress. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's basically kind of free radical damage to fats. And so there's all sorts of different fats that we might encounter. There's fats from any of the oils that we might be cooking. So sometimes we'll see if we cook past our smoke point, and then there's, oxidative, we damage the oils that we're cooking with, and we ingest that. That's one form of where we'll see lipid peroxides. We certainly will see in response to a lot of free radicals, a lot of exercise, things like that can also damage our internal fats, like in our cell membranes and all of those sorts of things. So that's something we definitely want to limit. We've even seen where people who've had supplements that are like, say, a fish oil that have sat on the shelf and kind of gone rancid over the course of 6 months to a year. That's oxidative damage to fats too. And so when I see high levels of this, I kind of put on my like detective hat and say, okay, like where could this be coming from? And in your case, it would be worth checking any sort of supplements that you have that are oil-based or fat-based, just to kind of see and making sure we're taking care to those things that do go bad, like fish oils. I keep mine in the fridge, for example.
Nice.
And also, are we good about the oils that we're using? What are high heat oils versus low heat oils? And then the last thing is what's going on from an internal stress perspective, whether that's exercise or whether that's just other forms of free radical damage, are going to be the main things I'd start looking into.
Yeah, that's really interesting about the fish oils. And do you find that, so the smoke point makes sense with, if you're heating your olive oil to 450, 500 degrees, whatnot. If people are eating more like traditional seed oils, which we hear about those being more like prone to oxidation, is that also something that could lead to the lipid peroxides, or do you not tend to see a relationship between like these industrial seed oils and the lipid peroxides? It's more about like heat damaged or light damaged fats, even if they're like quote unquote healthy fats. Is it hard to know?
No, like we do see some of that reflected when we get into the essential metabolic fatty acids section of this test. We start to see those pro-inflammatory levels rise. Specifically with lipid peroxides, it's probably more the heat and supplements and overall oxidative stress.
Yeah, but one place that we do oftentimes, it slips people's mind, is how often they go out to eat and they don't have control over things.
Yeah,
and
totally.
And we can see that across a lot of different markers for exposure too, like trans fats. Patty was mentioning we have a trans fat marker, and they're like, I don't do any trans fats. I don't know what you're talking about. It's like, do you go out to eat?
Yeah.
And so that's a big one that we tend to forget about as well. So, I think in this case, it's food for thought. And given that we saw a little bit of what I mentioned before, that indicator of the potential upregulation of glutathione production, I would be kind of just keeping an eye out for where some of this oxidative free radical might be coming from.
Yep.
Yeah. And then from there, I'm going to jump into the next section, which is the amino acids. Patty, do you want to talk a little bit just in general about amino acids and what they might indicate here?
Yeah, so we talked about this a bit earlier. Amino acids are the building blocks of protein. We need these to make enzymes, to make cells and muscles, everything in your body. So these are the building blocks, right? And we're measuring these amino acids directly in urine, and it usually reflects probably the past 48 hours of your dietary intake. So we always tell patients or consumers, eat your normal diet, that you usually eat if you're going to test. Like, don't quickly clean it up just to do the test. Eat your normal diet so we can see where you're at, because this is going to reflect about 48 hours, like I said. And there's different kinds of amino acids, right? You'll see at the top, these are essential amino acids. And what that means is that these are amino acids that must come from your diet. You must get these in your diet because your body can't make them. The non-essentials and some of these other intermediary metabolites your body can make based on what you give them. And so we sort of break them into sections. But again, you can't drive home the point how important amino acids are, not only to build muscle and to make enzymes, but amino acids are important to make neurotransmitters, right? It's important when you're thinking about mood disorders. This is where this comes into play in a big way. And so if we want to look at these results, Michael, you want to just high level these?
Yeah, in general, I just kind of float through the left-hand side of this page because I'm first and foremost asking the question, is somebody getting enough protein? Do they have an adequate protein intake? And so I kind of just draw a little bit of a line right down the middle and say, like, is everything kind of moving to the left of this line? Is everything moving to the right of this line? If it's moving to the left, I'm thinking we might have an indication, and I might want to check into like how many grams of protein they're actually getting, because people are always surprised. They always think, oh, I get plenty of protein, and I've had patients come in and do a protein diary. And then they're like, I'm only getting 20 grams of protein today. Yeah, exactly. Like, you need more protein.
Track it.
And so that's kind of the first thing that I'm always looking for. And also vice versa. If somebody's maybe, a weightlifter, bodybuilder, and they're consuming a ton of protein, are they actually overdoing it? Are we seeing tons of protein sitting around here? And we might want to back it off a little bit. Especially the next thing that kind of connects to this overall protein intake is actually over here in the urea cycle. This is how we detoxify protein and how the body gets rid of extra amino acids. And if I start to see that this is becoming a little bit, on the higher side, then I might be saying, okay, first and foremost, let's support that system. And again, here we think about magnesium and B vitamins are the main things that are going to support that. But then making sure that that's in balance with the overall protein intake as well.
I also want to point out, because you had mentioned this earlier, Michael, we draw this plumb line down the middle of that whole left side of the page. And hopefully most of them are in the green, or if we're on the lower side towards the yellow or red on the left, we're going to the protein diary. We want to know exactly what you're eating. And if in fact you're getting 100 and some grams of protein, now I'm asking, okay, are you not digesting and absorbing them? Right? That comes into play. Then the other piece are these athletes, to your point, Michael. They're just burning through these amino acids because they're needed for energy and they're using them to build muscle. So there's other information to be gained other than you're not getting enough. Do the protein and then go and say, okay, why is it still low then? What's going on here?
Yeah. Yeah. And to be honest, I'm not seeing a ton on this page, at least on your results, Casey, that is really, drawing any sort of like sirens, alarm bells, or anything like that. I will say there's an interesting part to this page, which is if we don't know about what somebody's diet is, or we think we have an understanding, we can look at this dietary peptide related markers. And this is more about protein intake. And so what we find is that these markers down here are kind of breakdown products of a lot of times animal proteins. And for example, this 1-methylhistidine tends to come from eating chicken, turkey, and fish. Is predominantly where you might get this 3-methylhistidine, or the 1-methylhistidine, which we did see show up to a good extent here. So it looked like probably around the time of your test. Keep in mind, this is a urine sample, so probably like the day or 2 days before the test. I would imagine that there was a probably good amount of protein consumption in the form of chicken, turkey, or fish, something like that.
Interesting.
The one underneath it is kind of fascinating too, because it doesn't as much reflect chicken, turkey, and fish, but more red meat. B-methylhistidine comes from what we call red muscle fiber. And people are like, why don't you say red meat? It's like, well, because actually our skeletal tissue is also red muscle fiber. So sometimes we'll actually get a vegetarian or a vegan and they have sky high 3-methylhistidine, and it's not that they're cheating, right? They're not just like not telling us that they're eating red meat. They're actually breaking down their own muscle tissue. They're catabolic. And so that can be a really big indication for them to say, look, you are not eating red meat, but you're breaking down your muscle. We know it's muscle because that's the only place you get this other than red meat. And you've got low amino acids. Like, we've got to sort this out because you've got to maintain your muscle mass.
Wow. Fascinating. Okay.
Yeah.
And what about the citrulline? Is that anything to it's 5.2 in the
Yeah.
red?
Yeah, I would say with respect to that, like I would be wondering if there's anything that you're taking that does have citrulline in it,
Mhm.
because it is a little bit of an outlier. Everything else here in this section looks okay. The ornithine looks okay. So I might just investigate, hey, is there something maybe in that mitochondrial supplement that you mentioned? I think that was
Mhm.
recording, or something of that nature that might show with this higher level of citrulline. And if not, again, B vitamins are the things that are going to help that urea cycle just kind of turn a little bit better without any speed bumps along, because it's another one of these cycles, and it kind of goes around and around and around, and all of that requires B
Yeah,
vitamins to keep that thing moving quickly.
fascinating.
So that's kind of what I'm seeing on this page. If I can figure out there we go. I've done this. So essential metabolic fatty acids are kind of the last, not the second to last component to this test. Patty, do you want to talk about
Yeah.
what these are? I think
Yeah.
people are familiar with omega-3s, but maybe not as much the whole kind of thing.
Yeah. So there are different types of fatty acids, and we talked about how fatty acids make our cell membranes. They're really important things for our cellular health. Omega-3s, most people may have heard, because this is kind of what fish oil is, right? These are very good for your heart, for your brain. Then we have the omega-9s, which are a different kind of a fatty acid, also good for your brain and your heart. Most of what's in the omega-9s is basically what you'd find in like the Mediterranean diet, right?
Mhm.
So these are very good for you. These are both the omega-3s and the omega-9s we like to see on the high side. The sixes, there are some that are pro-inflammatory, and you mentioned this earlier, Casey, but I will say this, evolutionarily, if that's a word. Is that a word?
That is word.
Yeah, yeah.
Evolutionarily, there was a time where the ratio of threes to sixes was nearly 1 to 1. And in today's society, with fast food and the changes of diet, it's nearly 16 to 1 in favor of the more pro-inflammatory omega-6s. So you want to keep a very close eye on making sure that there's a push towards the omega-3s and really looking at some of those pro-inflammatory sixes, which Michael's going to get into. But then we see saturated fats, right? And so most people hear this and say, saturated fats are bad. These are terrible, right? You'll see the food sources listed, meat, dairy, but fact is, some of them are actually pretty good for you and pretty beneficial. There's a lot of new information coming out about some of these saturated fatty acids that might be good. In fact, we just had this whole conversation with one of the experts in the field on C15, pentadecanoic acid.
Yes.
Some of these actually might be really beneficial. So it's hard to paint large swaths of this section's bad, that section's good. It's really just taking a step back and looking at it. And Michael, you said this earlier. You'll see on the right side, the other one we keep a close eye on are the trans fats. And that's in stuff like fast food. Again, these can be pro-inflammatory. And to Michael's point, it's fun when we review these tests because it's almost like a game show. Like we're trying to guess, we're trying to guess what we're going to get back on the phone because we already have told story in our minds. And we're like,
Yes.
oh, eat fast food. And they say no. And then Michael's point is, have you ever been to a restaurant? And they go, oh yeah. Yeah. So it's really interesting, but I'm going to let Michael kind of tell the story of yours specifically, but on this page, when I come to this page, the very first thing I look at is all the way at the bottom right, which is probably the most important biomarker on this test, and it's under cardiovascular risk. And we talked about omega-3s and how important they are for heart health. There is something called the omega-3 index, probably the best predictor and best biomarker regarding cardiovascular risk and health on this entire test. And the omega-3 index was created by Drs. Harris and von Schacke. And what it is it looks at the addition of DHA and EPA. And through their work, which has been verified over and over and over, using the same measurement that we do here at Genova, that, anywhere from 4 to 8 is risky. Greater than 8 is where you want to be. You want to be greater than 8 on this omega-3 index. And you're close, Case. So I'm going to let Michael kind of take how he wants to look at your results in context here.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, so you were at a 6.2 down here, and to be honest, it takes a lot of omega-3s to get somebody into the 8 range.
Yes.
We definitely prefer it over 4. That's really kind of the big cut point. But keep in mind, So one of the things that when I look at this page, I'm always thinking these are all percentages. This is not a direct measurement or like a concentration total. So this is like a big pie chart. And because of that, I start to look at, okay, well, what's the balance? What are the percentages of these main groups, right? What's the percentages of threes, sixes, nines? Because I want to know where's most of it coming from? And so we can see here with like the percent omega-3s, pretty darn robust,
great. Yeah,
right?
great.
And then omega-9s smack dab in the middle of the reference range. If I go down here, actually where you were lower was in your overall saturated fat intake. And then omega-6s was, maybe a little bit on the high normal side. And so the funny thing is once you work with all of those percentages, thinking like a big pie chart, a big pizza breakdown, actually when you compare the levels of omega-6s and omega-3s, you were leaning more towards omega-3s proportionally. You actually, compared to most people and most healthy people who helped to set the reference range, you were higher on your omega-3 intake compared to your omega-6s. So even though like this was seemingly almost in the yellow, which is kind of like nitpicky of all nitpicky, it was still counterbalanced with your omega-3 intake. So I would say in general, omega-3s, to be honest, look pretty good here. I wouldn't be like rushing to increase more omega-3s and fish oils and things like that, because when you put all of the pieces together, it was actually the fact that the saturated fatty acids were a little bit on the lower side, probably what shimmied everything else up a little bit.
Oh, interesting. So interesting.
Yeah. And of these saturated fats, most of them were coming in the form of stearic and tricosanoic, and that tends to come from ruminant fats, things like butter, and some of those other animal fats. Yeah. Chocolate.
Cheese.
Chocolate.
And then looking at the omega-6s, a lot of them are sort of in the red on the low end, and then the linoleic acid is higher. What should that be telling us?
We'll look at the next page, Michael.
How did you know? How did you set me up? So good.
Oh my gosh, this is my favorite page on the whole test. I feel like this test is the best biochemistry lesson ever, because it shows you how different pathways use the same enzymes and how those enzymes like need micronutrients to function properly. It's so fascinating. So I can't wait to hear. Also, are you guys okay on time for the next like 5 minutes, or are you sure? Okay, awesome.
Good.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it, that they all do require vitamins and specific nutrients, but also to remember that they're competing against each other.
They're competing.
And omega-6, right? That's fascinating. But I think it's helpful, Michael, if you just want to go down this particular pathway.
Yeah. So you mentioned that kind of what's going on here with this omega-6 group, and I normally will redirect people to the next page, because this is not an uncommon thing to find, is that if you look at the right-hand side here with this omega-6 metabolism, this is like a waterfall. Okay, so this one on the top, this linoleic acid, that's our main dietary form of omega-6. Like we get most of our omega-6 in this form of linoleic acid. Then the body has to get to work. And what you see is it has all these different steps to kind of churn on down through. And each one of these, and right in the middle here, you have the enzyme listed, which is a big fancy word, but more importantly, you have all of the regulators and cofactors that are required, right? And so you started with a higher level of linoleic proportionally, but then as each step went down, we struggled, right? And so again, I would be looking for these B vitamins. You see biotin listed as an interesting one here. We did see a little bit of that need for biotin show up earlier. We talked about that, but you're going from a high proportion level here down to kind of a lower one, and then an even lower one here as well. And the thing to note about this is we do kind of give omega-6s a bad rap and think they're all inflammatory, we should avoid them. But if you see here, this is DGLA. If you spend a lot of time in health food stores, you'll actually know like there's things like borage oil and evening primrose oil that contain GLA to try to get you to make more of this. You can't take this. Your body has to make this DGLA, and it is very anti-inflammatory. And so the fact that we're seeing this kind of waterfall have hiccups all the way down, again, is another indicator that we want to be making sure we're supporting with some of these cofactors to boost that up. There's other things that are involved in how well this works too, insulin being one of them. And that might go into a little bit actually of what you mentioned briefly before, Casey, about ketosis and hormone regulation and how there might be some things going on there. But in general, we would want to be supporting with these cofactors so that this all flows downstream quite a bit more. I did say you can't eat your way to good DGLA, but you can eat a ton of arachidonic acid, which is an inflammatory omega-6. This is kind of the one that we all hear about or think about when it comes to the association of omega-6s and inflammation. And that was actually not high as well, which is not surprising given what you've said about your whole foods diet.
Yeah, and there's a lot of like red meats and some of those other not so good, not grass-fed sources.
Right.
So if the DGLA is anti-inflammatory, but its next step is the pro-inflammatory, how do people, I'm not super familiar with, like, we don't worry about having high DGLA and then that converting to arachidonic acid, or like, does the body kind of know what to do with it? How do you avoid that going to arachidonic acid?
Yes. So the body will, again, it will utilize what it needs based on triggers in the system. So it's always balancing inflammation. Inflammation is not all bad, right? We use inflammation for a lot of different repair processes and actually to stimulate healing. It's excessive inflammation that we worry about. And so the body's usually good at modulating when to release a bunch of arachidonic acid into the system as compared to when to use DGLA. But the problem we run into is that when we have high levels of arachidonic acid on a test like this, it's generally not because the system's imbalance. It's likely more that they're eating more foods high in arachidonic acid, which is then driving a predisposition for more inflammation, right? It's external arachidonic acid consumption, not internal release and production.
Interesting. So there are foods that directly, it's not linoleic acid that's converting down, it's actually directly giving the body arachidonic acid.
That's
and is that like ultra processed foods and seed oils and things, or what are the top sources of that people should avoid for that?
Yeah, seed oils for sure, as Patty mentioned, less likely on the grain-fed, grass-fed, grass-finished red meats, but the conventionally fed red meats. And then also eggs will have a certain amount of it too. We normally bring eggs up when actually people have lower arachidonic acids because again, we do want to have some on board. And so eggs can be a source of arachidonic acid too.
Got it. Okay. And is it a correct, like one of the reasons I feel like I think about how we need to be really conscious of the types of oils we're eating and like really not eating the super high omega-6 dense oils, which is a lot of the seed oils, is because in doing so, you're also competing with these enzymes, which we also need to turn alpha linoleic acid into the anti-inflammatory like EPA and DHA. So we're almost like blocking our body's ability to turn plant-based omega-3s into really biologically active anti-inflammatory omega-3s if we're just gumming up the system with too many omega-6s. Is that a fair statement, or is that more like speculative?
No,
I think
you got it. I think you got it.
Yeah, I think that's really well taken. We have this segment on our podcast called Logical Speculation. Like, I think it's slightly speculative, but it makes all the sense in the world. I mean, these enzymes are always competing with substrates. And I think to compound that, another of the huge problems with all the seed oil consumption is just how much of it we are consuming, right? This is our body's essential form of omega-6. So we need to have a certain amount of intake every day. But the amounts in which we're consuming it now is something like 100x or 1000x, in actual milligram dosages compared to what we would normally get in the diet. And it's that also that I think is doing what you exactly said is gumming up the works for competition with the enzymes. We're also learning that they might have at high levels different interactions with some of our energy production systems like the Krebs cycle, that these fats, when they're utilized for energy production, they might not be able to provide as much energy and might actually be doing some damage to some of the mitochondrial function. So there's more interesting literature coming out on that, but we'll probably find there's like 10 different things that it's doing across the body. That's not great. Yeah.
Really interesting. And one other like tiny point on that side, I think a lot of people slam vegan diets because they say, oh, you're not getting any EPA or DHA. and too much alpha linoleic acid at the top left there. And I think something that comes to mind for me, and again, this is a bit speculative, is that, you know, these enzymes require all these critical micronutrients. So there's different ways to do a vegan diet. You could have a vegan diet that supports the conversion of alpha linoleic acid to EPA and DHA in this amazing pathway and avoids too much omega-6 competition, or you might be eating a processed vegan diet that doesn't have a lot of good nutrition and nutrients, and then you might be really having very high alpha linoleic acid and not converting it effectively to EPA and DHA. And that's like the blanket statements probably don't work, but do you see that? Like if you might have different types of plant-based people on very high quality, thoughtful, directed supplementation versus sort of more processed, that would show up in a test like this?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that makes this test so great is that it's agnostic to somebody's dietary strategy, right? And so the way that I think about it is anytime someone's making an intentional choice about their diet, they're doing it for probably a variety of reasons. And anytime somebody's restricting any particular component to their diet, there comes a risk of a potential deficiency. And this test is going to show that, you know, anywhere it exists. And I think to your point, you know, dirty is dirty, right? Whether it's a dirty vegan diet versus a dirty keto diet.
Right.
Those are all things that are only adding insult to injury, especially if you have some sort of limitation, like a ketogenic diet or a carnivore diet. Those are going to have different limitations, but it's still a restricted diet in a way, right? And so that's a conscious choice, and I don't think we would ever say don't make that choice about your diet, because anytime someone's intentional about what they're putting in their mouth, I think it's a good thing. But also understanding that you are to a degree restricting something, and there might be risks associated with that, and that's what makes a test like this so helpful in identifying those risks for that person, because it's going to be person specific too.
And that's why
I supporting. Yeah, go ahead, Patty.
And that's why I tell you, Michael's point about these being agnostic is exactly why we play that little game show thing when we're about to review the results, because we've already told the story in our mind and we're like, okay, this is dirty vegan. And they come back and they're like, nope, I'm keto. We're like, oh, it's dirty keto. And then we're like, yes, that's it. So to the bigger point, we see these patterns all the time. Yeah. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
And so the last bit, and so this is actually an add-on to the test. This is a urine evaluation for a whole host of different toxic elements that you can see on the left-hand side. And man, this looks really, really great, Casey. Yeah. Like to have one of these come back and it not ping for anything is pretty rare, given just how much we're exposed to on a regular day-to-day basis. And so the big ones I look for are certainly lead, mercury, aluminum, those are arsenic are kind of the big one. The biggest ones that we see very often. Your mercury was below detectable levels. Now keep in mind, this is a urine test, so it's not like there's no mercury running around in your body. It just means that probably within the small window of time prior to taking it, like say 3-4 days, you probably were not exposed to mercury in your diet. We can also look at these things in the blood as well, which gives us a little bit of a longer window of time to look for exposures. But that's always a good sign. And if you see things show up here, then again, what did you eat? Where did you get it? You know,
and it's easy for people to freak out when they see this come into the red. Arsenic, I think, is probably our best example that we see very commonly. Get people call up freaking out. My arsenic is high. And then we start going through some of the sources that we know. There's a lot of fish. A lot of chicken and some rice are known to have arsenic. And then we always look to your supplements. Where you're getting your supplements? Are they nutraceutical? Are there fillers within the supplements that you're taking that you're not even thinking about, let alone your exposures in the environment? So this is really just a wake-up call to say, go looking. Where is it coming from? What can you clean up? To Michael's point, this isn't body burden. This is just a recent exposure, and it's a warning signal to go looking and put on your detective cap.
Yeah. And same conversation for some of the more nutrient elements on the right-hand side. Again, this is looking in the urine to see kind of what you are getting rid of in the body. And so to see some of these below detectables, it's actually not surprising. Our body typically hangs on to iron. It typically hangs on to manganese and a lot of these minerals. It only is kind of excreting them when we're probably having, a large consumption of it, such as like magnesium. I think you mentioned that you were taking a good healthy dose of magnesium and supplement. which is probably why we're seeing this high level kind of come out in the urine. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're taking too much of it. It just means your body's, it's processing it and getting rid of it as part of its normal just processes. So that being said, this part is a little bit of, in my opinion, kind of difficult to run down and tends to reflect a little bit of what is more in somebody's multivitamin because it's coming out in the urine. And it's only when things are kind of suspicious, like if I have a high copper level coming out in the urine, or for somebody's, peeing a lot of vanadium or something like that, then I'm like, what's going on there? Like they're not taking it, like there's some inflammation and or balance in the system. Other than that, I'd probably say the rest of these, nothing surprising here.
I will say we've talked for the past hour about all of these vitamins.
Have we?
All of the. Yeah, no, it doesn't feel like it.
Flew by.
Totally, we geek out with Casey whenever we're with her.
This is so awesome.
With that being said, you don't have to memorize all of these things. Like I said, we've done the work for you on the first several pages to act on these results. But if you do want to geek out, you can, watch this video and geek further. But if you go to the end, Michael, you want to show where you can find the support guide?
Yeah.
At the end of every live report, scroll to the next page, maybe. Where is it?
There it is.
There it is.
There, yeah.
User error.
If you click on this hyperlink, it will take you to a fully literature-cited support guide that literally explains every single biomarker, what it means when it's high, what it means when it's low. If you want to geek out, you don't have to. In order to act on the findings of the test, go to page 2, look at the front page pillars, and read through the food sources. But this is what that guide will look like if you hit that hyperlink at the end. It's a lot.
Yeah.
But you don't need it. You don't need to go through it. We've done the work for you. But if you want to geek out, you're like us, you're like biochemistry, go crazy.
And we also have a lot of videos on our website as well, report walkthroughs and things like that for those who want to learn a little bit more about certain things that they might find on their test results. So a lot of resources for anyone who does want to do the geek out work.
We also have Michael and I. Casey Meads has been on our podcast several times. It's called the Lab Report. And we literally will take a biomarker or a section of this test and just do a whole 30 minutes and just totally go crazy. So if you want to check that out, that's another resource for learning.
Shameless plug.
Do you tend to recommend that people, I know that you can stop your supplements or you can choose not to right before the test. What do you find is the best option for people?
It depends. And that's another joke on our podcast. It depends. Well, if you're showing up to a clinician's office, brand spanking new to a functional medicine doctor, they may ask you to stop your supplements to get a baseline, to make sure you're not taking a bunch of useless supplements that you don't need. But a lot of clinicians just test on their supplements because they want to know where you're at. What do we need a little bit more of? So they want to know, is it working? Is it enough for you? What else can this tell us? So it depends. If you want a baseline, then we would recommend stopping them. If you want to just see where you're at, then stay on them.
Yeah, I think that works for anyone out there who's maybe been doing a lot of dabbling here and there. They've been on this for a long time, then they added that, and they've kind of been on this little adventure on their own. It might just be a good idea to just kind of just start over and just kind of pull everything out and say, all right, let my system cool down and let's check my system and see what the system is telling me it needs. And then I'll go from there. I think it makes a lot of sense to me.
Though we don't recommend anyone stop any medically necessary medication or supplements.
Don't do that.
There are a couple of medications that can interfere with 1 or 2 analytes, and we list those right in the collection pack instructions. Never stop anything unless you're checking with your clinician if it's a medication. And as far as supplements, you can always refer to your doctor, or if you don't have a doctor, you want to try off some of the supplements, that's up to you. But it depends what you're looking for.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Thank you.
One thing that came up for me when I was taking the test was it is a blood spot test. And the first one I pricked, I don't think I pricked hard enough. So it was tiny little droplets. The second one, I got like a fire hose and it worked great. But it does say, don't touch the blood to the paper. And like a few times I did. Is stuff like that things that people really need to worry about? Or, if you're not getting the paper like dirty, but your finger touches it a little bit, like how much do people need to these are the kind of questions I get or have. So how much is there that precision, matter for the results of the test?
I would say generally it has a small potential impact.
Okay.
I think from a lab point of view, we have a lot of issues where we have to call and ask for resubmissions because we do a lot of testing and sometimes we have samples fail or there's some contaminant or there's something like that. And so from the sense of like trying to remove all potential problems, that can be kind of pretty strict as far as like make sure to drop the blood into the circle, don't touch it. So I think, if you can accomplish that, it just really helps to make sure that we don't have to call and say, hey, we need you to do this again.
Got it.
Do the best you can.
Yeah.
If the sample gets here and they can't get the information they need from it, you'll hear about it. They'll ask you to resubmit.
Very helpful. I mean, the tip I would have for people is with the Lancet to actually push a little bit hard. And I think that I got a much better blood flow when I really actually pierced a little bit harder, as opposed to kind of just like lightly pushing on the Lancet. And then I was able to fill the circles like no problem. So, little tips like that. But, and that you do want to restrict water a little bit with this test beforehand. And so that does change the blood flow. So I think for me, getting around that was actually just making sure I got a really good puncture with the Lancet, which doesn't hurt. It's just was a little bit of luckily you give 2 Lancets so you can try twice. Yeah.
Let me ask you a question, Case. So you've been through the process. You went through Connect. You ordered the kit. You got the kit. You looked at the collection instructions. You did it. You got the report. What's that experience like for you? What are some things that you can offer feedback on?
It was very easy. I mean, ordering the test was a piece of cake. You just order it like you'd order any product online, and it came very quickly. It's a kit with a lot of stuff in it. So I actually recorded a video for my YouTube channel unpacking the kit, just because I think the first time you see it, it can be like, wow, there's a lot of tubes and there's baggies and there's, filter paper that you need to put in the right bag, and there's a freezer brick and you have to kind of sequence it out. So I would just say, like, don't worry. It's actually really quite simple. Read the instruction manual. There's videos online, and basically just like I would get a piece of paper out and kind of make a little schedule for yourself. Like, okay, Tuesday, I'm going to only drink this amount of water. And then I actually put the collection cup for urine on the toilet the night before, because otherwise you want to get first catch urine, and I will forget if I don't have the cup right there. So I actually screwed up one day and then put the cup on the toilet the next day. And then just making sure, just sort of having a plan it's probably a 2 to 3 day plan that you need to have, from prepping your water and your, supplements if you want to stock them, and setting out the right stuff, freezing the freezer brick. So I think actually writing down a little schedule once you've read the instruction manual can help get your head around it more. And then the blood spot just dries. And I think then you have a little bit of wiggle room with the timing there. And then the urine's in the freezer. So I think it actually is easier than the Nutraval shipping in a sense, because that you do with blood work in a lab and you have to ship it, I believe, the same day. Whereas with the blood spot, you don't have this urgency to get to the post office like within an hour of when you get the blood drawn and stuff. So tell me if I'm right about that. With the blood spot and the frozen urine, do you have like a day or two of wiggle room to ship it back?
You do. Yeah, it's pretty darn stable once that blood dries on the card.
Cool.
So yeah, you have a day or two to like you said, you don't have that urgency of like, oh my gosh, everything's gonna die on the card if it doesn't
right.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. Yeah.
Plug for that video. I saw your unboxing video and I was blown away. And I was like, Casey Means should work here at Genova.
I love getting to collaborate with you guys. Well,
Yeah.
I just remember being intimidated when I first was ordering this test for patients. And it's like sometimes actually just like having people touch it and show it to you and be like, this is actually very, very doable. So I just recommend anyone getting the test to watch that video on my YouTube, so that they know what they're getting when the kit comes. Just get your head wrapped around it. But fundamentally, it's really, really quite simple to do the test. You pee in a cup and you do a blood spot test. It's not that complicated, and then you ship it all back. And so, and then the resources online for interpreting your results are unbelievable. And this is obviously such a privilege to get to talk to you guys about my own results. But I mean, my takeaway from everything you've said is like, it's a lot of it's not surprising. Like the oxidative stress is higher than I think it probably is at baseline. And then that is also feeding into some mitochondrial stuff that I need to work on. And then there was some gut stuff. And I think for me, it's like, this is not that surprising. It was April was the month before my book launch. And I was sort of, traveling a ton, doing a lot of like Human Lab podcast and this stuff, and I felt like my cortisol was like high. So, you know, it's funny because the test confirms some of the things that I knew. And then since the book came out, it's like I'm back to like totally regular sleep schedule, not going on airplanes, like making sure I got off coffee because I feel like my cortisol. So it's like, it's actually just like the test is so helpful to put a lot of data behind some of the things I think I was intuitively feeling and like be a really great motivator for direction. But I guess I'll put it back on you for maybe the last question. Who do you recommend this test for? I would say everyone, but I would love to hear like if there's people that you feel like this is a really great one for.
Michael, you want to go?
Yeah, I would say that in general, I think there's a couple different facets and people that will do really well with this information. You mentioned, the fact that testing can really help steer people to kind of the areas that they need support. And so if people have been, kind of trying to figure things out on their own and bouncing, and they still have this kind of chronic condition they can't figure out, or not even condition, but they just don't feel quite right, and that like they haven't really been able to figure it out, it's really great at guiding people that direction. But you also mentioned the testing is really, really great for just as a motivational perspective too, to sort of confirm. And so, we have kind of this new data, come an aspect to our lives these days. And so oftentimes when we have something like a wearable, CGM, or we have, our Whoops or things like that, where we're monitoring some of our health data, it helps us to just become aware and to be motivated to continue to doing the things that we know is good for our health. And so I think that's really good from a prevention standpoint. And I guess the third one is for any of our athletes, people who are doing any sort of endurance training where they're putting a lot of strain on their body and they're trying to get, from that 90% to 99% or things like that. It's really great at being able to pick out some of those little details that really might just mean the difference in that 5%.
I have two more I want to piggyback on top of that.
Love.
One is mood disorders, right? We talked about this earlier. Mental health is such a big crisis in our world today. And so the lack of some of these vitamins and amino acids are really important for mood. The other is chronic fatigue, or someone who's just fatigued, because we saw the Krebs cycle page. We saw these mitochondrial markers. We see that there's no energy being made here. So it also underscores, to Michael's point, data is compelling. Right? When you see that you have these insufficiencies that can really explain some mental health issues or fatigue or optimal performance for an athlete, I mean, it's really compelling information. So to your point, further, Casey, I would agree. I would say everyone needs this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Especially if you're taking supplements or are feeling confused about diet. It's like it will tell you which foods to emphasize and which not to. And if you're taking supplements, ultimately we're kind of throwing a shot in the dark if we don't have some direction of like what we actually need. So this is the thrill of a lifetime to get to go through my actual results with you two. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know we went so far over. I'm so appreciative of you two. And I just recommend everyone listen to the lab report. I love this test. I'll put my discount code in the show notes as well. And I can't thank you enough for the work that you're doing to help make the world a healthier place.